Right. Well, it's an interesting session about the chaos and conflicts that are happening right now in Southeast Asia, and I looked at particularly on Muslim, non-Muslim relations in the region. I think there's so much emphasis on terrorism, on what we call as high-scale or upscale conflicts, and there's a lot of emphasis on violent actions. But what I was trying to say yesterday is that we need to shift our focus from the eventful to look at everyday forms of chaos and conflicts. And I talked about how there are conflicts that are happening at an everyday basis in so many parts of Southeast Asia, especially when you look at Muslims and non-Muslims behaving towards one another. And I talked about minority, majority, antipathy. I talked about latent and manifest discrimination, discrimination at work, discrimination in the marketplace. I also talked about how we are now seeing a lot of social distancing. Malays, for example, are so much into halalness, what I call as halalization process, and they are very much in fear of being contaminated, such that they wouldn't want to, for example, eat with a non-Muslim who are eating non-Muslim food. We see that even in Singapore, in South Thailand, in Philippines and other places. And I also talked about how these chaos are now manifested in a kind of social pathology where people look at other people from the perspective of conflict. So a Malay, for example, would look at a non-Malay as a source of threat, be it at work or even anywhere. And you see that especially in a very conflict-ridden place such as South Thailand. The Muslim Thai, for example, in the south, would often look at the Buddhist Thai as an enemy. And this is a consequence of many forces that were at play in that kind of society. So one of those things that I tried to emphasize in the talk is for us to be sensitive first of such conflicts and chaos that are in us. And we tend to take these things for granted because for us, either we tend to normalize these things and say that, we can't deal with it, so you live with it, or we just push it aside. And when some big event actually takes place, such as a riot or a terrorist or an insurgent kind of violent action, we say that these things are done by a select group, by a minority group. But this minority might just represent a silent majority who are indeed having some kind of bad feelings towards Muslims or might be from the other side. So I'm saying that we should be sensitive of the kinds of everyday conflicts and chaos that are in our minds, and to acknowledge it and to talk about it and to not push it under the carpet and say, since it's there, let's just live and let live. Many people tend to assign blame for exclusionary practices to religions. And what I spoke about yesterday is that many of these problems of the inability of communities to speak to one another is a consequence of the death of cosmopolitanism. People aren't cosmopolitan anymore. And here I referred to yesterday to this work of this man, he's a philosopher, Anthony Appiah, who wrote about the cosmopolitan ethic, where to be a cosmopolitan, be it whether you're a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Christian, is to be curious of other people's cultures and to have empathy of other people's cultures and to be accepting of differences. And this is something that we have lost. And we have lost it partly because, the way I see it, due to a few factors. One of which is the kind of ethnic politics that are at play. And here, not only that the politics are ethnicized, even religion gets ethnicized in the midst of it, where people see religions as belonging to a certain ethnic group. So Islam equals to Malay, Buddhist equals to Northern Thais, Christianity equals to some parts of Northern Philippines. And we tend to assign our ethnic identity, or we tend to link our ethnic identity to our own basic identity. And because of that, we lose that sense of being able to be with other people, being able to, and I was talking about it, being able to respect strangers and to see them and us as sharing a common humanity. So if we have problems of people not wanting to sit together in a coffee shop if they belong to different races and different religious groups, it has to do with their minds telling themselves that I am fundamentally different from that person, and there is no way that I can be like him or I can like him, and there's no way that I should not even find out why is he different from me, and share that common space to talk about why are we different, and to say that, okay, since we are different, why don't we sit down and understand this difference. So I think that the main problem here is not really only with the rise of Islamization or Christianization or Buddhization, but with the death of this cosmopolitan ethic that is there in us actually as human beings. We are born basically with this idea of being curious to find out about things. And there was a point in our lives, because of ethnic politics, because of ethnicized religiosity, we tell ourselves we shouldn't be finding out about other people's religions. And that affects everything else, our social practices, the kind of friends that we choose, the kind of alliances that we make, and the kind of people whom we trust. So one experiment I did in Singapore is to get a group of religious teachers to take out their handphones and to name me 3 names of Chinese persons in their phone that they could trust. And that Chinese person, I'm talking to a Malay crowd, would be the plumber, the mechanic, or some unfortunate guy who did some repairs in their homes. So we have this big problem now, even in a country like Singapore, and we have to resolve this as soon as we can. Well, I think we have to return back to this whole notion of a shared space. I grew up in a so-called in a ghetto in Singapore, and as you rightly say it, in the kampungs, Malays, Chinese, Indians, they mix around quite easily. In fact, if I can relate, in Singapore, Chinese in the 70s would learn how to speak some kind of pidgin, we call it Pasar Malay. And Malays would try and learn some little Hokkien and Cantonese to get by and to make sure that they can talk to the Chinese. Why do they do that? Because they have a notion of a shared space. Even though they have this idea that you must have your own private space, where your family and people of a certain race must talk to one another, they acknowledge that there must be a bigger shared space for everyone, where we learn how to speak to one another in a language that is almost pidgin actually. It's a mix of Chinese, Malay, a little bit of Indian, and we learn to recognize that we can share this. I think the problem of racism has to do also with the problem of language. When you emphasize that everyone should speak in a language that you say is pure, then they will develop that myth of purity in their minds. I'm not trying to say that we all should speak pidgin language, but when we don't celebrate this hybridity that is out there, we lose the essence of us living together. So we have in certain countries, even in Thailand and the Philippines, where they emphasize that you need to speak pure Tagalog in order for you to be real Filipino. And in Thailand, where they are forcing Muslims in the south to speak pure Thai when their so-called inherited language is Malay, there will sure be resistance. I don't want to do that. But if you tell everybody that, okay, yes, you have to learn your own so-called mother tongue, but we also celebrate a kind of Singlish, then you have a different scenario altogether. People learn how to talk to one another in their own ways. And this is where I think I blame states for a lot of the racism that are happening throughout Southeast Asia. I think there is a concerted effort on the part of many states around Southeast Asia to emphasize that a given nation state should recognize one particular language as the national language. And that's a big, big problem. Because when you emphasize that everybody should speak just one language, you tend to do away with hybridity, with the fact that there are so many smaller languages out there. And what you do at the end of the day is to force everybody to come under the rubric of what the nation sees itself as uniform. So it is partly, and I talked about yesterday, I talked about the violence of the colonial inheritance. What the British had left for us is this idea that we should all have our own racial space, and that racial space comes together with the language of our own. What the post-colonial state have done is to say, all right, we have our own racial space, but there is one dominant racial space, and that dominant racial space would either be Malay, Thai, or in some countries it would be English. And that leads to people feeling that if you don't speak Malay well enough, or if you don't speak Malay like the Malays, for example, we find it very difficult to accept you. And you see it in a country like Malaysia, you know, even though some Chinese can speak better Malay than the Malays, but the ways in which they speak Malay has some kind of Chinese twang, then you cannot accept that. And the same is it with the Indians, the same is it with the Eurasians or the Europeans. And I think we need to do away, I'm not saying that we should do away with the emphasis on the ability to speak a language in its pure form, but we must celebrate hybridity in society, be it in language, be it in terms of identity. This claim that one is a pure Malay is to me so tenuous, or one can be a pure Tausug in some part of southern Philippines is also that everyone is a hybrid, and we need to acknowledge this hybridity. And this is something that I think states are responsible of, but also intellectuals play a big role, where they emphasize again and again there is such thing as Jati Diri Melayu, there is such thing as this pure Malayness that we can recover, but at the end of the day it's a dream that is non-achievable. And when it's non-achievable, people tend to invent myths to make sure that people believe that they can be pure as against other people who are impure. I don't know, I think many people are a bit disturbed by some things that I said. I think that some might think that the things that I shared may apply to a conflict-ridden country like Thailand and southern Philippines, but less so in Malaysia. But I also feel that when it comes to the Malaysians giving comments about their own society, they tend to say, yes, we recognize the problem, but we're not really sure how we can solve this problem. And that's why I said just now, what Malaysia is in stasis, you know, where we say in Malay, hidup segan mati tak mau, you know. You don't know whether you want to move forward, you want to move backwards. You don't know whether you want to emphasize purity or should you celebrate hybridity. You're not sure whether is it the state that is a problem or is it the people that is a problem. And I think there needs to be an exercise where people come together and acknowledge that there is a problem, there is some kind of latent racism, there is some kind of manifest discrimination, and we must deal with it either through policies, or I think the more potent form of solution would be through education. And if there's any place that needs reform in a country like Malaysia, Singapore, South Thailand and Philippines, the schools, they have to be changed. And we should stop having these ethnic-based schools that we have in Singapore, as in the case of the SEP schools, that tend to reproduce a kind of purity that is in a sense very mythical. And this whole idea that we can be a pure Chinese. Well, people from China also wouldn't say that. But it's again drummed into the minds of certain races in the country. Yeah.
But Singapore, you don't have any more vernacular schools, right? Do you still have?
Yes, we still have what we call as SEP schools. They don't call it vernacular. They call it as special assistance schools, and all of it are Chinese schools practically, where they imbibe Chinese values. Nowadays, they are accepting Malays and other races into the school, but the very existence of these schools beg the bigger question, you know, are we truly moving towards a Singaporean Singapore, or are we actually privileging certain groups and not acknowledging that we should actually make everybody integrate into the larger population? Take note that these schools are not private schools. I mean, the counter argument would be, then we should also close down the madrasas, because the madrasas are all ethnic based, mainly Malays, right? a few Indians, but the madrasas are private schools. They are not governmentally owned. And I mean, if you are a private school, you can do basically anything you like. But if you are a public school, but you generate that kind of racially inclined values, then it might pose a problem in the future. If not now, someday, somehow later. I think in most, except for the SAP schools, most schools in Singapore will reflect the racial distribution of Singaporeans. So basically about 70+% Chinese, 12 to 13% Malay, and then maybe 10% Indians, and then you have the others. So you have some Europeans, Eurasians, and it cuts across the board basically. Maybe in some places where there are traditionally Malay enclaves, where I used to stay, like Jalan Eunos, Geylang and Bedok, you have more Malays and Tampines. But throughout Singapore, schools are a microcosm of what Singapore's society are all about. In that sense, we are a bit better than Malaysia and South Thailand and Southern Philippines. We do recognize that you must have a multicultural makeup within the schools. But then we have the other problem of people segregating themselves, as you were saying just now, in the schools itself. So Malay students, for example, wouldn't want to eat in the canteen with Chinese friends. And we see this happening at an early age, for example. It could be because, you know, you feel for your own people first before you start to mix around. But I think we need to try and find ways to make sure that different races interact with one another in school. Since 1965, since we broke off from Malaysia, there has been an emphasis, and when the Malay schools were closed down practically, there has been an emphasis that you need to have a kind of distribution within the schools. But then, like I said just now, the SAP schools are still maintained. And there in the SAP schools, they are not reflective of the larger Singapore society. You're talking about basically 90% Chinese, with maybe 10%, that would be a big number also to give. Maybe 95% Chinese and 5% others. And these people will be the cream of the crop in the country. And if at an early stage in their life, they don't have interactions with other races, then we might encounter problems in future. If not now, perhaps someday. Well, I think inter-ethnic, if you want to have a scale in Southeast Asia, I think in Singapore, partly because everybody is economically driven rather than politically driven. I mean, we have more politics now than ever before, but because everybody is just concerned about bread and butter issues, I think people get along pretty well. Somehow, we recognize that we need to share a common space because the space is already so small. Singapore is such a small country. There aren't real much opportunities for people to form their own ghettos. Interracial relations really depends on the kind of attitudes that one have actually towards oneself and others. And I think the Malays still need more effort to try and mix around more with the Chinese. That said, I think we do have problem within the Chinese community of not being able to stretch their arms to their Malay friends and to their Indian colleagues as well, because they are a majority. And usually when you are a majority population, you don't see the problem. And I can see it in a place like Malaysia as well. You talk to the Malays and you ask them, is there racial polarization in Malaysia? No, we get along fine. But of course, when you go to the other side and you talk to the Chinese, they will say, but they don't even talk to me. So I think what we need to do in Singapore is to make the majority population a bit more aware and sensitive of the lives of the minorities. And as I was saying yesterday, they need to speak for the minorities rather than wait for the minorities to speak for themselves. And the example that we can give are the blacks in England and the blacks in America. Their strive to be accepted as equals in society are born out of the efforts of the whites in their society. The white people spoke up for them. And I think we need more of these kind of examples in Singapore and in Malaysia. Malays must speak up for the Chinese, and Chinese in Singapore must speak up for the Malays. Then I think we can have more interaction and increasing levels of trust between people. The Wahhabi scare, I call it the Muslim peril, you know, and this whole idea that Wahhabis are everywhere. On one hand, it's true in the sense that there are so-called this group of people that hold on to a very Puritan version of Islam, and they have a loud voice. On the other hand, I think we tend to overblow their importance. But I want to push a bit more into your point about Islamization. I do readily admit that Islamization, as in a Malay form of Islamization that is very assertive, can lead to people distancing themselves from one another. But Islam as a religion do not promote this segregation. And I think what has happened in Southeast Asia, partly it has to do with the Saudi government, but I don't think they really play a big role. But it has to do with the ways in which we have interpreted our Islam. It has become an Islam that is very much Malay incorporated. You know, it belongs to us. So who is the Quran for? It is for the Malays. What is the Hadith for? It is to help the Malays advance themselves. I think that is a fundamental problem of not Islamization, but a problem of interpreting Islam as an ethnic part of an ethnic identity. And I think we need to decouple that. It is difficult, partly because traditionally we have always said that Malay equals to Islam. But I think there must be efforts to explain that as you become more and more pious and more religious, you are able to accept differences even more. And I think it has to start with the people who I call as the intellectuals, which includes clerics as well, they have to start teaching the people on the ground that to be a Muslim is to accept universal values and to accept the unity of humankind. These are not taught in the pondoks, these are not taught in the madrasas, these things are not taught in even schools where they have religious education. And I think Islam in Southeast Asia especially needs a radical reinterpretation, one that promotes a very strong slant or brand of cosmopolitanism. But that, I mean, it's kind of a tough call, you know, to give. But I think it's possible if more and more young intellectuals come in, like Dr. Asri, for example, who's very progressive, and they start to come out and talk about these things. You know, talk about being ready to accept other races, talk about being ready to accept the fact that other religions have other ways of looking at the world, at looking at their relationship with others. And I think it has to start at that level, at the level of intellectual engagement with what Islam really stands for. And there has not been so many of that. It's all surrounding issues of Islam Hadari, things that make us even more exclusive rather than inclusive. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you use the word acceptance quite a lot, but over here we don't use acceptance no.
Alright.
We use tolerance a lot.
Tolerance, not accept. So you tolerate, but then you don't accept them.
That's right.
Okay.
You know, so maybe they should use acceptance a lot more than tolerance.
Yeah. And acceptance is part of the Malay culture. Orang memberi, kita merasa. Orang berbudi, kita berbahasa. Orang memberi, kita merasa. That means you accept. People give you a gift, and it's a trait, it's a reciprocity trait that is in the Malay culture actually. And Malay culture has always been accepting. Historically, Hinduism came, we accept it. Islam came, we accept it. Modernity came, we accept it. But once the nation state has been born, we start to construct boundaries and markers around us. And I think this phenomenon of Malays becoming unaccepting but more tolerating is a recent phenomenon. I think it's maybe from the 1980s, where suddenly everybody feel that they have a sense of privilege, that they are more equal than others. Then they start talking about, oh, you know, we cannot just let them in. We must close the doors and make sure that only some people can come in, but the rest we just keep them out.